Over there a little bit.
We'll take a few questions for Bryan.
Yeah.
I have another one. No, I'm going. On the theory of if we build it, they will come. I happen to have I will inherit shortly a piece of land in rural Arkansas. Okay, but it's about 10 miles from the Arkansas River. What can I do on that property now? My mother lives there now, so it's what, whatever, to make it friendly for and possibly attract a breeding pair or even juvenile eagles to come in.
Yeah, I think the main thing in terms of the piece of property is the same that we always talk about, location, right? So if it is in a location that is conducive for them to colonize, as in it has the aquatic resources that they would use
Is
nearby.
10 miles too far?
10 miles is getting out there a bit unless you had a supplementary pond.
Yeah.
But
If I dug a catfish pond.
they might. Yeah, that might be the quickest way that you can do it. Yeah.
It's got pines on the property.
Yeah, providing the conditions that are, yeah, that's the answer, is providing the conditions that are conducive for them to nest. So if you provide the resources they need, they're more likely to be there. And that's the reason why there's so many pairs here in the Bay. I mean, not only does the Bay support now the densest population of eagles, they're the most productive, the chicks grow the fastest of any population throughout the country. And it's because the Bay is just such an incredible place.
There's just one thing to Bryan's presentation. That is, it's not just the decisions that we humans make, but the eagles are making decisions that are making it a little more complicated, like the pair here at the Botanical Garden, when they're moving into established neighborhoods that have been there for years and years and years. It's presenting some challenges, and they're not all good for the eagles, may not be all good for us as humans. And one of the benefits that we've had here at the garden is to try to understand what the influences are on the birds, our activities, and how they are impacted. And it doesn't seem to be disturbing them very much, which is not what we have historically known about eagles. The more remotely located pairs, for example, I check each year with the ones at Back Bay and Falls Cape Landing and so forth. You can't get close to those nests. Within 1,000 feet or so, they start squawking at you. These birds could care less. I mean, they let us walk right underneath, cut the grass. So that's something we're having to learn, and that's another factor that's making it a little more complicated, the decisions that we're having to make.
I have a question, Mike. Are they starting to move more inland and separate out
Yes.
toward the mountains?
Yes, they are, and we don't know as much about that. Our survey really is on this side of the fall line where we think most of the pairs are, but we know we've done some flying. I fly in the Piedmont in North Carolina, and we fly some places here in Virginia in the Piedmont, and that population is clearly growing. Not at the same rate as this one, but we have 700 pairs on the coastal plain. My guess is that we have to probably have 100, in the Piedmont Mountains now. We know of some of those, but not all of them. And it has to do with all these farm ponds and things, so some of these pairs are pretty adaptable. They'll trap line farm ponds. They might have 5 farm ponds that they're working, but...
Miss Lazillia does the catfish farm.
Yeah.
In the back here?
Yeah, what would happen? What happens to what restrictions are put on an existing homeowner if a pair of eagles would make a nest in the backyard or the neighborhood area? What restrictions are?
Well, the guidelines are that existing activity is allowable. So if you had a pair that came in and nested next to your driveway, it's not like you couldn't drive your car into the driveway anymore. The existing activity, the assumption is that that pair moved into a certain activity situation, and so that's fine to maintain. There may be a concern about, building an extension to your garage right next to the building. So there might be some of those restrictions, but in terms of existing activity, it wouldn't be restricted, or there wouldn't be a request to reduce that. As Reese says, we're starting to get, in the 1980s, we never thought that we would have any of these pairs in urban situations, but that sector of the population we looked at a couple of years ago, and it's now like about 3 to 5% of the population is in these fairly heavily urbanized areas. There's no indication currently that there's a difference in productivity, so they're producing just as well. I think there are signs of hope in that for the future, in that, you know, one possibility is that we set aside lands for eagles. Another possibility that maybe we hadn't considered in the 1980s is that maybe we can cohabit in places, and that requires the eagles to be more adaptable from a disturbance standpoint, as Reese said. And so we're starting to see that in the population. And it might be that that will be the growing part of the population into the future. And if that's the case, then, you know, maybe we don't have to set aside as much property in the bay as we thought maybe we did. The other part of that is that the nests that we have on refuge lands, set aside lands, reproductive rates, I looked at this recently, are actually significantly higher on those, like refuge, Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, state refuges. They do tend to do better than they do on private lands currently.
I would add, though, that I compiled the data from 2005 through last year. Only this nest at Botanical Garden and one in Prince George County, which is a rural nest, have had consistently 3 chicks each season.
Yeah, but this pair here...
This is an exception, I think.
We are.
Yeah, I have been looking at territories over the past couple of weeks, and this pair may be at the top. You know, it's very rare. And another thing that we see, and I didn't mention this, but I've been looking at quite a bit lately, is in the first year that a pair is formed and they attempt to breed, they're likely only 50% to be productive. And that goes up in the first 5 years or so. Brood size goes up in the first 10 years. So a first-year pair has less than a 2% chance of producing a 3-chick brood. But as you get to 10 years out, it's more like about 16 or 18%. You can see it's still a fairly small portion of the overall population doing that. So that's why this pair has been so exceptional. I mean, it's incredibly rare outside of the Chesapeake Bay to have a 3-chick brood. You know, and for this pair to be producing it, you know, routinely is unheard of, really.
We'll take one more question. We're starting to run short on time. Brian and I both have other commitments this afternoon. Have one other question? Angie, you have one? Oh, over here.
Who imposes these restrictions you keep talking about? If you got a landowner out there and he wants to build
Yes.
an addition, who imposes these restrictions?
Yeah, so the regulatory agencies, there's one for the state, which is the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. So they have responsibility for eagle management in the state. And at the federal level is the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have management responsibility for eagles federally. And so it's those two agencies working together, federal and state, that imposes, you know, restrictions to protect eagles.
You tell a landowner what they can and can't do.
Yes.
Yeah.
To connect with that still, the last 2 questions. So how far, like if this new nest from the golf course up to a residential area at Bellevue is right next to Route 1? In other words, how far does that extension go? Should we try to take a look and stop something from happening on Route 1 for these eagles if it's less than, I don't know, let's say 1,000 yards away?
Yeah, that outer buffer there is a quarter mile. So it's 330 feet is the inner buffer, which has the highest restriction on activity, and then the outer buffer is out to 660. And so there would be recommended restrictions on activity within those buffers, depending on which buffer the activity is proposed for.
That's just the
Are
backside.
restrictions really enforceable though?
Are they enforceable?
Yeah.
Yes.
Especially when it involves private developers. They can see a nest, they want
Yes.
the money, you know.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can see the
Enforcement.
conflict that we're facing, right? Private property rights versus eagle protection. But yes, under the, as you know, eagles were delisted from the Endangered Species Act, which had all of these legal mechanisms to restrict things to protect eagles. But eagles have their own law, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act of 1941, and they are carrying the same restrictions. So yes, and the way that it's typically enforced is that the landowner is told that they can do this but not that. If they abide by the guidelines and something happens, the pair abandons or something happens, then they will not be prosecuted under federal law. If they do not abide by the guidelines and something happens, they likely will be prosecuted under federal law. And so it's not that there's law enforcement there, stopping the bulldozers. It's that if something happens, then they are liable.
Okay, one more, Bobby.
It's on Eagles, but it's off topic a little bit. When we were in Jupiter, Florida, we saw a presentation on birds of prey. They had an eagle that was 13 years old, and to look at the eagle, it looked like it was about a 3.5 to 4-year-old. It had a dirty head,
Yes.
tail, and the eyes were brown. It was always in captivity, it never flew. And they said they thought that the reason that it didn't go white and the eyes didn't change is maybe hormonal changes that didn't take place, or that was your opinion on it?
Well, hormonal changes certainly could restrict maturation. There is some variation in that, where you get some individuals that will hold dark feathers in the head, for example, in the hood, their entire life. So there is some variation in that, and there's some variation on the transition period. Some individuals, it might be 2 years later, like 7 years, that they attain full adult plumage. So there is some natural variation in that. But no, I don't know about that specific bird, but that's incredibly late. Yeah, that's really late. Really late.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Watts for coming down and making his presentation today.